Peace and blessings, brothers and sisters. It is so wonderful to be with you today. My name is Dr. Regina Jennings. I am the creator of Readings with Regina. And one of the main reasons that I created this YouTube channel or special is because I really want to encourage people to read more. In this age of technology where people are on Facebook and other platforms, I have noticed that, in particular, young people and some middle aged and old people too, are just not reading books enough, especially books that will help us. Like we used to say back in the 1960s and 70s, nation time. Let's build a nation. And this is what we were saying. So, how does one do that? Because in America, most of us under a capitalistic system, we're consumers. So, how does that fit in with reading? It fits in with reading because when you read a book, your brain functions in levels that are just magical. Your brain literally makes more neural or synapses connections, which expands how you think. And it also, in many instances, has a direct effect of the health of your body. You see, reading is different from looking at a movie, which is okay, or documentary, or television, although I encourage you to look at as least amount of TV as possible because those shows are not made for the benefit of your growth and development. Reading, your brain has to be active. Watching a program or movie is passive. You're sitting there taking in images. But reading, you're dealing with a mental process that will help you in all of your endeavors while you are on earth. And I really want people to consider that we are on earth, that we are on a planet, and we're not sure exactly how we got here. But this is what we do know. We know that when a man ejaculates sperm into a woman, the sperm is in the millions. On the first episode, I said thousands. I'm correcting myself. The man ejaculates millions of sperm. Check this out. But only about 100 or 200 literally go through the obstacle course to get to that egg. And that sister girl egg is just sitting there being her wonderful self. And when the sperms approach her, she then decides which one she's going to fertilize with. And guess what? That fertilization is you. So I know that people are gifts to this earth if they behave that way, because they can also be terrorizers to the earth as well, which is one of the reasons that I have chosen this magnificent book, Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny. And it is written by the most brilliant Mumia Abu-Jamal and Stephen Victoria. Now, on our first episode, we went over empire. Some of you might remember. And I said that the United States, as it was becoming the United States, they built that process on Roman law. On Roman law. And I also talked about genocide. Because genocide is how the United States began. I also mentioned last episode that there were millions of red nationalities here when the Europeans came. Millions. And the genocide that they carried out reduced that number to thousands, if that. And I also talked about manifest destiny. And I'll continue to talk about manifest destiny in this series because it is very important that we understand the mindset of the enslavers who came over to this country, committed genocide on the Red Nations, and then built boats, went over to Africa, and dragged many of us, or most of us, or all of us over here. Manifest destiny. The enslavers literally put together a theory that undergirded all of their laws, and that theory said God wanted them to come to this part of the world to enslave and commit genocide on the people here. So, of course, they couldn't actually say it that way, but they did use the word exterminate. Exterminate, which is akin to genocide. So I'm going to pick up where I left off last time. And again, I'm reading from Murder Incorporated by Mumia Abu-Jamal and Stephen Victoria. And this, because I know some of you have got the book and you're following along, I'm on page 43. It says, blinded by the light. Slavery for us is defined by two concepts. One is straightforward, economics, and the other has to do with flesh, blood, and terror. Not the usual framing of American slavery that exists in the abstract. First, the economic definition. The imperialist conversion of humans into instruments. The imperialist conversion of humans into instruments for the production of goods. With this definition, slavery is a practical exercise in the commercial world, similar to any capitalist endeavor. Cheap labor, very cheap labor, coupled with the distribution of product. At the time, it was perfectly legal, morally acceptable, and great for business. What a windfall. You get your workforce for free for centuries. The second definition centers on slavery as physical and psychological terrorism, perpetuated not by, as history would have us believe, magnificent and caring paternal white father figures like Jefferson, that's Thomas, that is, which with his hope of civilizing these savages that Jefferson had no problem fathering children by. Just, check out Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was 14 and Jefferson was 52. Okay? So do understand that dimension in age. But rather perpetrated by psychotic purveyors of violence for profit who were then exonerated by scribes, writers, then and now, absorbed of any real crimes. Nobody has been persecuted because of the enslavement of Black people. You know that. It's just another classic case in the history of mankind of when the power elites make, I love this term, they made the unthinkable normal. Enslavers made the unthinkable normal. The myth remains safe, and the whitewash of history not only pardons these scoundrels for crimes against humanity, it actually vindicates their evil actions. If the reality were actually contemplated to its core, the force of this terror would shake every foundation this nation rests on. One would be forced to come face to face with a reality that would include the following highlights. 1, the theft of human beings from their home, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, who were then shackled and transported on slave ships that can only be described as beyond shocking, where conditions would make a maggot vomit. Pure and unadulterated horror. 2, when this journey through hell ended on the pristine shores of America, these so-called animal savages, in reality, the brave and resilient human beings lucky enough not to have been clubbed to death and tossed in the Atlantic, then began the multi-generational nightmare of misery and anguish. Human bondage, bought and sold away from your family on a master's whim, whippings, beatings, bludgeoning, vicious rapes, tarring and feathering, castration, the removal of limbs for what were called minor infractions, forced to fight human cockfights. Dig that. Hangings, more hangings, and of course, executions on demand. And then you wake up the next day and you do it all over again. Next. Now, in case we forgot the real and lasting terrorism of slavery, let's add the psychological hell to the physical hell. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the most prolific advocates of exposing the long-term psychological toll caused by slavery and in its monstrous practices. Practices like selective breeding, which helped to ensure that the master had an ongoing supply of strong slaves capable of performing superhuman feats. Look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. Oh, it's Super Mandingo. The sheer terrorism that was American slavery is another clear-cut horror that runs unbridled through American history, responsible for devastating an incalculable number of families, their structure and value debased and obliterated well into the future and into the present. I'm going to stop for just a moment just to say this to you all. We are still, as a people, suffering from the ravages of being enslaved over 300 years by white people. That hasn't disappeared. Now, I know there are people even in academia, because I've heard them. They have said, well, that was so long ago. It wasn't that long ago. It absolutely was not that long ago. And no matter how long ago it was, memory doesn't die. For many Black people, over the more than 30 years that I've been teaching, this particular memory has been pushed down so that we could go forward. But even it being pushed down doesn't mean it's eradicated. And it can even explain some of the behaviors of African American people today. Now I'll get back to the book. The Paradox of Liberty. Lest we forget, this chapter is about the great white Aryan Anglo-Saxon civilization's commitment to follow the sun, to civilize the world, and help all the unfortunate savages, because that's what we were called, find Jesus. One of those civilizing Anglos was, of course, Thomas Jefferson. In fact, the Smithsonian installed an exhibit dedicated to the greatest gentleman slave owner of the United States, entitled Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. Author Leah Caldwell writes after visiting the exhibit, quote, "It doesn't bode well that if you entered the Jefferson exhibit not knowing what slavery was, you might come out thinking it was an intensive training program for highly skilled craftsmen." Nevertheless, Edward Rothstein's review in the New York Times is a classic example of the establishment's fourth estate, protecting the status quo, when he actually criticizes the exhibit for stating that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence did not extend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to African Americans or Native Americans, indentured servants, or women. Rothstein wrote that this pushed too far and that each of those cases needs different qualifications and examinations. They distract from the subject. In his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, another book I highly recommend, and anyone going to college or any university, you have to read Frederick Douglass. It's now quite required. Anyway, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, the great social reformer, remembers his first thoughts regarding his condition. In fact, his reflections on his own experiences offer an appropriate response to Thomas Jefferson's cheerleaders. This is Fred Douglass. He asks, "Why am I a slave? Why are some people slaves and others masters? Was there ever a time when this was not so? How did the relation commence? Once engaged in the inquiry, I was not very long in finding out the true solution of the matter. It was not color, but crime, not God, but man, that afforded the true explanation of the existence of slavery. Nor was I long in finding out another important truth. What man can make, man can unmake." Here's another answer for those who like to contextualize about those masters who own, subjugate, and crush other human beings. It's never considered okay to own another soul, unless, of course, you're modeling yourself after Satan. Remember, this wasn't during the lower Paleolithic period. It was during the so-called Age of Enlightenment. In his essay, Jefferson's Crime, Not Mitigated by the Standards of the Time, journalism professor Robert Jensen frames Jefferson's blameworthiness. Quote, "Certainly Jefferson was familiar with Paine," that's Thomas Paine, a very important historical figure that you could look up. "Certainly Jefferson was familiar with Paine and the arguments against slavery. Certainly Jefferson was aware of the existence of the idea that all humans had an equal claim to liberty and the argument that Africans should be considered human in these matters. Certainly, there were many different ideas about the institution of slavery and racism in play at the time. So, we are not judging Jefferson by the standards of our time when we point out the way in which he employed racism to justify the barbarism of slavery. We are acknowledging that others in Jefferson's time, including such notable figures as Thomas Paine, articulated anti-slavery and anti-racist principles at the same time that Jefferson was in 1781 writing in his Notes on the State of Virginia about the natural inferiority of Blacks. And here's another aside that I'm going to give you about Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. He had the audacity to insult African women by writing that African women made love with orangutans on the continent. That's why our vaginas were so big. He wrote that. Now, of course, now this isn't from the book, this is from Regina. Now, of course, he would know about the various sizes of women's private parts because he raped a whole bunch of African enslaved women. But the most celebrated one was what I mentioned earlier about his relationship with Sally Hemings. And let me just say this. They have made movies about that relationship, and they acted like Girlfriend Had a Choice, that it was a love affair. And Thomas Jefferson was in his 50s and she was a teen, and he owned her. Let's not get it twisted. And I talk like this because there has been a definite movement to erase the validity, the truth, the terrorism of enslavement of the African people in the Americas. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the book now. Now this is, where am I? Monticello, that's where Jefferson lived. Jefferson's neoclassical Virginia brick villa, stoically perched above 5,000 acres of rolling green hills. His plantation, once tended to by hundreds of African slaves, from Jefferson's divine resting place, vistas stretch forever and the Blue Ridge Mountains loom to the west. Monticello is a popular tourist attraction where Jefferson's slavery component is, for the most part, whitewashed. Down the hillside where it flows to the Rivanna River, which connects to the James River, past other sprawling Virginia estates that should rightly be categorized as America's colonial terrorist camps, also known as plantations. It's as if we've been erased, observed one African American visitor. The iconic architectural element of Monticello is the dome structure that towers above all else on this celestial home. Many believe the dome to be nothing more than a stately aesthetic element. But factoring in Jefferson's obsession with African slaves, actual testimony from his slaves, and an architectural concept called the panopticon, a darker, more deviant purpose emerges. Lucia Cinder Stanton, Monticello's senior historian, envisions Monticello as a panopticon with Jefferson, the all-seeing, at the top. He could see everything that was going on. Jefferson's library contained a copy of a book called Panopticon that outlined a new and controversial prison design that called for circular cells surrounding a central watchtower. Inmates would be unaware if they were being watched. At least two former slaves talk about Jefferson with his telescope, watching enslaved people at work, Stanton reports. So this whole concept of surveillance from his central place on the apex of the mountain came through the oral tradition. He could see out, but nobody could see him. Equipped with his telescope, this warden in a powdered wig would gaze down from his heavenly dome, tracking his enslaved labor force on Mulberry Row, or in the fields, or wherever forced labor took them. And notice, my dear beloved people, whites have always loved to watch Black people. I mean, there was a time, I'm sure many of you have heard of the minstrel shows. What was that? What was that when whites would put on blackface to entertain audiences? And then, of course, Blacks started putting on blackface too. That was a whole cultural unit. So Jefferson, Thomas that is, used to watch his slaves. Okay. The enlightened Jefferson kept meticulous records of almost everything associated with his life. Two subjects stand out: vegetables and slaves. Novelist and professor Jamaica Kincaid, with regard to lettuce, cabbage, carrots, cucumbers, and peas, she wrote, "The Garden Book," this is Jefferson's Garden Book, "has details of the things he planted, the food he planted, but it looks as if it just falls magically on the table. So he'll say, peas were planted. 6 weeks later, peas appear on the table. There's no involvement of labor. There's no soil at all. It's as if it's Eden. It doesn't have any evil in it. But when it comes to the checklist of Negroes, y'all know that we were called Negroes. African American came later, in large part thanks to Malcolm X. But anyway, back when it comes to the checklist of Negroes owned, as calculated by Jefferson, Kincaid says, the farm book, on the other hand, is all evil, very similar to his book about peas, corn, beets, and other vegetables. The farm book is a painstaking record of the human beings Jefferson owned. Quote, Betty, Martin, Phenia, Creta, Sally, Johnny, Daniel, Molly, and so forth. Sinister? Yes. Evil? Absolutely. Now I want to skip a part here because I want to go to a remark that the great historian Howard Zinn made about slavery, because many in America will say, well, slavery existed in Africa. It did. It absolutely did. But check out what Howard Zinn has to say about that. Slavery existed in the African states, and it was sometimes used by Europeans to justify their own slave trade. But as Basil Davison, I recommend his books too, as Basil Davison points out in his book, The African Slave Trade, the slaves of Africa were more like the serfs of Europe. In other words, like most of the population of Europe. It was harsh servitude, but they had rights which slaves brought to America did not have. And they were altogether different from the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantation. So most of the presidents of the United States in the early years when slavery was legal and encouraged and a part of American culture, they owned slaves. That's very important. And if you want to get more information about that, I highly recommend a book by Margaret Kimberly. It's called Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents. That is a wonderful book. Margaret Kimberly is an outstanding writer. She writes for the Black Agenda Report. So I highly recommend that book because you should see how slavery was very much a part of the fabric of America. America would not be the America that we know now if it wasn't for the barbarous way that our ancestors worked for centuries for free. And I am emphasizing that point because in current discourse, in current discussions about slavery that I have listened to, it is downgraded, and some, even Black leaders or so-called leaders or influencers or whatever, are saying such things as Black people milk the slavery narrative. We don't milk anything. We only milk a cow. Slavery, that saga of slavery, has never really rested easily because we were not given the reparations that we should have been given when the so-called peculiar institution was supposedly over in this country. And I want to even point this out. I have seen some documentaries where there are some people right up to the 1960s, because of generational slavery, they still thought they were enslaved and were treated as such. So we have a long history that it is important that we know every step of the way. This is why I am reading this very important book by Mumia Abu-Jamal and Stephen Victoria, because it goes back into the history of this country. It examines bit by bit the thinking of the lawmakers. Because understand, slavery was legal. The rape of Black women and men was legal. The breeding of Black women and men was legal. Selling our ancestors, buying our ancestors was legal. So you need to understand that. You need to put it within the proper context of your thinking. Well, brothers and sisters, it's been marvelous to be with you. And again, my name is Dr. Regina Jennings, and Readings with Regina will come on twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. So I will see you January the 21st at 2 o'clock. And I want you to know very sincerely that I absolutely adore you all. And I hope that you will hang with me as I go through this series, because I am doing this series for you. It is imperative, I think, that I do this kind of series because currently There is a movement to undercut our history. And I want to say this to folk as well. As an original member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which I am so proud of, we were at the dawn of creating Black Studies. Black Studies was not given to us. It was fought for and won. So, for those of you who are entering college at this time, you must take a Black course or Black courses, or take it as a major or a minor. You should do this. And I am saying this because I have heard some students say, it didn't fit my schedule. I had to concentrate on my major, which was communications or some other subject. People don't do that. We were given nothing in this country. And Black studies, Black literature, Black writing was fought for. Just ask Phyllis Wheatley. Well, she's dead now, you can't ask her, but take my word for it. So in any event, it's been fantastic being with you, and I will see you again next Tuesday. Bye now.